All right, so most countries have a single written rulebook, a constitution. But what happens when one of the world's oldest democracies just doesn't have one? Today, we're going to try and crack the puzzle of the UK's unwritten constitution.
So let's say you wanted to actually read the UK's constitution. Where would you even look? It's not like the US Constitution, which you can go see in a museum. The UK's version isn't in one single document, which, raises a pretty big question. If you can't point to it, does it even really exist?
Well, the answer really comes down to one key difference. You've got your codified constitutions. Think of them like a single protected instruction manual. The US Constitution is a perfect example, but the UK has an uncodified constitution. Its rules are scattered all over the place, in laws and court decisions, and even in unwritten traditions. It's less like a stone tablet and way more like a living, breathing thing that's always evolving.
To really get our heads around this puzzle, we first need to understand the unique characteristics of this missing rulebook. What defines a constitution that isn't even written down in one place?
Okay, so there are 4 key things to know. First, as we've said, it's uncodified. Second, it's unitary. Now, that just means that the ultimate, final power is all in one place, the central parliament in London. Third, and this one is a real game changer, it's incredibly flexible. It can be changed by a simple act of parliament, no crazy complicated amendment process needed. And finally, it's a constitutional monarchy, which means you have a king or queen as the head of state, but all the real political power, that sits with parliament.
Okay, so if there's no singles document, where do we actually find the rules? This is where we have to put on our detective hats and start piecing this whole thing together from all its different sources.
The rules are basically pulled together from 4 main places. You can think of them as the key ingredients in the UK's constitutional recipe. You've got statute law, common law, authoritative works, and then the most mysterious one of all, conventions.
First up, the most powerful ingredient, statute law. These are simply the acts passed by Parliament. They are the top dog, legally binding pieces of the puzzle. Some of these laws, like the Human Rights Act, are so important they're considered constitutional statutes because they really define the relationship between the government and its people.
Next, we have the common law. This is law that's basically created by judges. Over hundreds of years, their decisions in specific court cases have built up major constitutional principles. In fact, maybe the most important principle of the whole system, the idea that Parliament is the supreme lawmaking body. That's a product of common law, created and protected by the courts.
And this quote just illustrates the point perfectly. The famous expert A.V. Dicey actually described England's system as a court-based constitution, which really shows you just how important judges have been in writing the country's unwritten rules.
And that brings us to our third source, authoritative works. These are the super influential books and writings from experts like that guy Dicey. Now, they aren't law, a court can enforce them, but they're treated as really persuasive guides that help everyone, from politicians to judges, figure out how the Constitution is supposed to work.
Right, now we get to the most mysterious, and you could argue, the most powerful source of all. Those unwritten rules that basically tell politicians how they're supposed to act.
These are called constitutional conventions. The best way to think about them is as the gentlemen's agreements of the Constitution. They are not written down in any law, and you absolutely cannot take someone to court for breaking one. But they are seen as politically binding, and they are essential for making the whole machine of government actually run.
Here's a perfect example, royal assent. So, after a bill passes through Parliament, it goes to the monarch for their official approval. Now, legally, the monarch could say no, but by convention, the monarch always gives their approval. This is so ingrained that it hasn't been broken in over 300 years.
So this raises a massive question, right? There's no law that forces the monarch's hand. So what would actually happen if they just broke with tradition and refused to sign a bill into law?
And here's the crucial point. It wouldn't end up in a courtroom. There's no law to be broken. Instead, it would trigger a massive constitutional crisis. The political fallout would be absolutely huge, which proves that these conventions are enforced by political pressure, not by judges. And these unwritten rules are so important for democracy. The idea that government ministers have to answer to Parliament for what they do, that's a convention. The rule that the Prime Minister has to be someone who has the support of a majority of MPs, also a convention. They basically weave democratic accountability right into the fabric of the political system.
Now, what's so fascinating about all this is the debate it kicks off. Is this incredibly flexible, unwritten system a stroke of genius that's allowed the UK to evolve peacefully for centuries? Or is it actually a dangerous flaw,
just waiting to be exploited.
Well, there are really two sides to this coin. On the one hand, its flexibility is a huge plus. The Constitution can adapt to new social values without some massive, rigid amendment process. But on the other hand, this creates a ton of uncertainty. The rules can be fuzzy, and it opens up the risk that a government with a big majority could just change the fundamental rules of the game to suit itself.
And this quote from the political scientist Vernon Bogdanor just captures that risk perfectly. Because there's no higher entrenched law to stop it, whatever the ruling party manages to pass in Parliament is, by default, constitutional. It's a system built on trust and tradition, not on hard legal limits.
So this all leads, naturally, to the big, nagging question that never quite goes away in British politics. Should the UK just finally write it all down? Create a single, official constitution?
But it's really not as simple as it sounds. Can you imagine the political arguments over trying to define these unwritten rules? It would be a nightmare. And even if they did it, new unwritten habits would pop up to fill in the gaps. As one parliamentary committee put it, trying to write down a convention is a contradiction in terms. Because the second you make an unenforceable rule legally binding, well, it's not a convention anymore. You've changed its entire nature.
And so, in the end, we're left with the ultimate puzzle. Is this unique, unwritten system a clever, adaptable feature that's allowed British democracy to survive and evolve for centuries? Or is it a fundamental bug in the system, a crisis just waiting to happen in our modern, polarized world? That really is the question at the very heart of the UK's constitutional identity.